doing some leadership training and breaking down what it means to be a good leader, being exposed to good leaders, interviewing good leaders, sort of informed me, right? So that, what I mean, if anyone who's a facilitator knows, it's an amazing classroom because you end up learning so much and gaining as much from the class and your development as you do otherwise. And I think, and honestly, right until this very moment in your question, I don't know if I ever thought of it that way, but it's that, doing a deep dive into leadership training and what good looks like. Because I didn't want hashtag hypocrisy when I was standing in front of a room teaching, leadership training. So, that definitely informed a lot of what I did, and how I got to where I am today.
Hello and welcome to the Leadership Launchpad, where we help managers improve themselves, their teams, and their organizations. On this show, I talk with industry leaders, coaches, authors, and experts to give you actionable insights that will help improve your own performance and the performance of those around you. Our guest today is Anthony Calleo, the founder and chief employee experience officer at Calleo EX. With a background that spans large enterprises like Disney, innovative startups, and financial services, Anthony seeks to blend the art and science of human capital management to drive organizational excellence and create thriving workplace cultures. In this discussion, we cover the current state of the employee experience in corporate America, how you can learn not just from your good managers, but also from the bad ones, why mid level managers are so important, the perils of fear based leadership, and so much more. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind everybody that if this is your first time listening to the show, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you are already subscribed, it would mean the world to me if you would take a moment to like or rate this show. It really makes a difference. And with that, let's get into the discussion with Anthony Calleo. Anthony, welcome to the Leadership Launchpad. How are you doing today?
I'm doing outstanding, Matt, and super excited to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm really glad we got to do this. You and I chatted a few weeks ago after getting connected, and I know we're going to talk a lot about leadership. That's kind of what we're primarily going to dive into because that's what the show's primarily about. But your company is focused on kind of a bigger picture idea of employee experience. And as we were talking right before the show, I mentioned I think we're in kind of a weird state where it seems like, you go back to 2020 and COVID, and employee experience became like the focus area of a lot of organizations, especially as, lots of talent was moving all over the place and everybody was worried about keeping people. And at least in the last, I don't know, maybe 6 months or so, it feels like the pendulum swung a little bit, and a lot of organizations are maybe not so focused on providing a good employee experience. So I just wanted to get it from you, like, what is the state on the ground of kind of employee experience that you're getting a sense of from your conversations?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal observation. And I got to say, that was not just folks that did employee experience, but culture, but just, I would say, HR and internal communications in
Yep.
general. Our
Yep.
biggest fear was when COVID's over, right? Or when the
Mm,
pandemic, kind of slows a little bit. Now, that would be definitely something to celebrate. But
yeah.
from an engagement standpoint, right, from an employee experience standpoint, are we going to suddenly start being less intentional? So what we had
Yeah.
found was that it was a lot easier to get the resources and get the
Yeah.
initiatives approved during COVID, right? And so it was an exciting time, but we always kind of like, whispered to each other because we didn't want to say it
Mm,
out loud. Like, is this going to
mm,
change when, COVID, and, COVID started with, 2 weeks to end the curve. And then it, kind of just, as the pandemic unfolded, it stretched out, and we kept asking ourselves that. And so, yeah, I think that, there's a lot of things happening, right? There's, sort of a, taking your foot off the gas on employee experience. There's the
okay.
entire work, remote, hybrid, we want you all back in the office
Yep. Yep.
argument, which is all part of an employee experience. So it's, really it's folks like, that are in my space and in HR that are really trying to, make our way, through all of this. Right. But no, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. I think we were, and one of my favorite words, and I apply it in a lot of different areas, is being intentional. And we were
Yeah.
very intentional about our employee experience, employee engagement, and doing, fun stuff. What were you wearing for Halloween? What's your go-to comfort food? I mean, we were just doing some really cool, fun stuff, which, quite honestly, I think as an employee experience, and I'm sure the internal communications folks out there say, like, we've always wanted to be doing this kind of stuff, right? So
Yeah.
we were able to kind of run a little loose and wild and use our imaginations during COVID. And now there's been sort of an easing off on it a little bit. And that's sort of that, continual struggle and debate that we have with our businesses about, like, this is how you want your employees to be engaged. It's not this, like, this one-time special thing. And we can get into this, when we talk about leadership in other areas. But I firmly believe, and I think a lot of people are on the same wavelength, that it's going to be increasingly an expectation on employees that they are engaged and they are, they
Yeah.
have positive employee experiences.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean it's definitely been a trend that probably isn't going away, and I think that it might seem like a lot of people can pull their foot off the gas right now because it feels like, everybody's asking, are we in a recession? Are we not? There's lots of layoffs. And so as you get into kind of that softer labor environment, probably generally companies feel like they have a little bit more leeway.
For sure.
But if you look at the longer term trends, like there is no way that we don't re-enter a tighter labor market where there is fiercer competition for talent. So it makes sense that it's still going to be a continuing trend, that it is something to focus on.
Yeah, no, for sure. And listen, to me, it separates the have to do's between the want to do's. Like the companies that
Yeah.
had to do it because of COVID, that's one thing, and they're sort of backing off. It's the companies that wanted to do it that are the ones that
Yeah.
sort of could sustain it. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's what I observe is, the debate, if you want, if we're technically in a recession or not. The fact of the matter is the job market has tightened and things have, as you say, swung back into the employer's favor, right?
Yeah.
And so that's definitely having an effect. I think, just sort of like the great resignation, what's going to happen is once the market starts loosen up again, there's going to be sort of another great reckoning, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you really want to have those companies that, understand the importance of it and want to do it and not feel like they were compelled to do it in response to in response to a pandemic or whatever the, situation was.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, you mentioned this idea that this was something that kind of those of us in HR were kind of feeling, but often, I mean, this as well as I do. When it comes to things like employee experience, the place where the rubber meets the road is with the leaders,
For sure.
right? And I often think, as these changes happen, we're sending signals to leaders about kind of what we're expecting of them, who they're supposed to be. And thinking back to the conversation we had a few weeks ago, you brought up this idea of leaders wearing masks,
Yeah.
and having some kind of expectation. I think, in terms of our discussion about leaders, I would love to start there, of this kind of idea of where do you, in your experience, where do some of these ideas of who we're supposed to be as a leader tend to come from for new leaders?
I mean, I think in a much broader sense, it comes from your entire book of beliefs, right? It comes
Yeah.
from, what you learn from your parents and what you learn from, school, and then how you were mentored when you grew up through, through a company. And you talk to a lot of organizations, and they want formal leadership training, right? They want to develop their leaders, but more often than not they're battlefield promotions, right? And
Yeah.
we can get a little bit deeper into how and why people are promoted. But yeah, that was the biggest thing for me. Listen, uh I went through it, right? When I, even prior to me taking a leadership role, I came from a time and place where and I worked in some environments where I couldn't show up as my authentic self, and I had to wear that mask every day, right?
Yeah.
And so I was the person I thought my managers at the time or the organization needed me to be, and then eventually my people, right? And so it takes, not only does it take leadership training, it takes a lot of self work, self love,
Mm.
working on yourself, right?
Mhm.
Before you could show up as a leader for somebody else. And the pressure not only does that have on your people and the organization that you're leading? But ultimately, you're bringing that stuff home, right?
Yeah.
To whatever situation, and you bring it to your family or your partner, or whatever the case may be. And so it's not a great place to be. And I think, yeah. So I mean, I think that's what I meant by the wearing of the mask is, and to me, that's the ultimate. Like we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is under a little bit of pressure nowadays.
For sure.
It's the ultimate belonging in that scenario is for folks to show up, individual contributing leaders to be able to show up as their authentic selves. Right? To me, that's the ultimate environment.
Yeah. Yeah. What, you're talking about kind of that self work, that inner work that you need to do. What did that I know very, I definitely went through a lot of that for myself when I first became a leader. I don't know, what did that look like for you, since it sounds like you were kind of in an environment where there were these certain expectations of who you should be. Um I guess there's two parts of this. There's the inner work. Yes, how much of it was the inner work that allowed you to show up as as kind of an authentic leader, and then also what changes had to happen around you in the organization to allow you to show up as an authentic leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me address the last one first, which is I
Okay.
think there were a lot of organizations that didn't necessarily allow me to show up like that, but I was lucky enough to have some really good leaders that I reported
Yeah.
into that did, right. So because you
Yeah.
can't always, I would love to say that you can always look at the tip top of the organization or like just the organizational culture, but sometimes
Mhm.
you just got to look at your immediate management, right, and the
100%.
enablement that they allow. Um, and then kind of just to go back, I learned a lot. I learned a lot from my really bad managers. I don't even want to label them leaders, right? Because
Yeah.
I don't think, folks that don't lead don't deserve that title, right? So I
Yeah.
learned a lot from my bad managers, and there's one or two routes, right? You can either get mentored by that and replicate that, or you can remember how that made you feel, right?
Yeah.
And so that sense of, hey, listen, I wasn't showing. Not only am I not showing up as my authentic self, I'm not really feeling great about myself, right? And that could all that all leads to what I dealt with was a hefty dose of imposter syndrome that I also had to work through as well. As we developed on, so it was a lot of work on myself. And honestly, Matt, it wasn't just like one thing, right? It was a combination of having really good leaders, and then I was in the unfortunate position where I started in this space as a learning and development professional, right? And
Yeah.
so doing some leadership training and breaking down what it means to be a good leader, being exposed to good leaders, interviewing good
Hmm.
leaders, sort of
Yeah.
informed me, right? So that what I
Yeah.
mean. If anyone who's a facilitator knows, it's an amazing classroom because you end up learning so much and gaining as much from the
Yeah.
class and your
Absolutely.
development as you do otherwise. And I think and honestly, right until this very moment in your question, I don't know if I ever thought of it that way, but it's that doing a deep dive into leadership training and what good looks like,
Hmm.
because I didn't want hashtag hypocrisy when I was standing in front of a room teaching leadership
Yeah.
training. So
Yeah.
that definitely informed a lot of what I did, and how I got to where I am today.
Yeah. It kind of feels like that is another reason, we can kind of nerd out on like the instructional design portion of it and the
Yeah,
L&D portion of it. Another reason to include leaders in your organization in the lead as facilitators or as mentors in your leadership
for
training, because I
sure.
think a lot of times maybe we assume, oh, the leaders out there, they're super busy, they got stuff to do, we can take it all on our shoulders, we can do all the facilitation. But yeah, even probably those mid-level managers, engaging them, as long as you can coach them to be good facilitators and everything, because you're 100% right. Like teaching this stuff, engaging this stuff, even before you are an expert in it, can really step up your game.
Yeah. And listen, you hit on something really important, which I think a lot of organizations don't often do, is there's one thing to teach what good looks like. there's another
Hmm.
thing to show it, right? So by having
Yeah.
those leaders come in and
Yeah.
talk to talk to the guys, you're actually showing what does good look like, and that applies to a lot of different areas. Like when you're trying to instill missions, visions, value, and purpose, we
Yeah.
put the words out there and we talk about the behaviors, but we often doesn't don't showcase what good looks like, and that certainly could
Yeah.
get done through rewards and recognition. But having your leaders come up, step up, and have those leaders basically participate in the training. Yeah, no, it's very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to highlight what you said earlier because I think it's really, really important. The power that mid level managers can have.
Yeah,
Because I've been in what it sounds like exactly the same situation you're in, where I am in an organization where if I look to the top, I know for a fact that's not what I want to do.
right.
That's not what I want to be. It's craziness. It's hectic. Oh my gosh. But my manager, my direct leader was so good. She was just able to create this like space of calm and understanding in the middle of a storm, and it just transforms you. And so for any listeners, I think, because I think what you're saying often happens is there's an easy ability to kind of pass the buck upward
Yeah.
of, oh well, this is the way the organization is, or oh, I can't do this. But every manager at every level can choose to change the experience that the people below them have.
100%. And listen, as you were saying that, Matt, it's also, I've had some great leaders. One in particular who I'm extremely fond with and still close, worked under her leadership she was a chief HR officer for me. Is you have a good leader that could protect you from against yourself too, right? It's that,
Mm-hmm.
because there are times when, you don't have that buy-in from that senior leadership, right? And you can get easily dejected, and having somebody mentor you through that and work you through that and still have your back, I think is fairly amazing too. And I mean, it's almost like a cliche now, but what do we say? People don't leave companies, they leave bad managers, right? And we
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah.
We've known that for years. And I got to say, conversely, some really good managers kept me staying in companies that
Yes.
normally maybe didn't have the full cultural alignment with my values.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. How have you, I don't know, have you, what are some ways that managers can do that? Because I think this is a really important idea of like you mentioned this idea of kind of coaching you and getting through stuff, protecting you from things that also has potential risks associated with it. I don't know. I mean, do you have any thoughts on kind of how far, and this kind of goes along, I think, with the employee experience thing, like how far can an individual manager like push away from the organizational culture almost, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, listen, the ultimate answer is everyone needs to make a judgment call, right? And I've
Yeah.
become the older I've gotten, and maybe you could say I've gotten grouchier, but I've become less tolerant of not great
Mm,
cultures, right? So it got
mm,
it
mhm.
got to the point where it's wonderful I have a great leader, right? But if I'm not
Yeah.
inspired by the organization and its values, it's time for me to self-select out and move on, right?
Yeah.
And I know for some people that's easier said than done, particularly as we said, if we're in a tight job market. But I'm a big believer in being super vulnerable, right? I know that's what I did when I was a leader, right? Or when I eventually understood what it meant to be a leader and not just a
Yeah.
manager, is being incredibly vulnerable with the people I worked with, and have that coach mentoring mentality, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really just a case of being vulnerable, and also like, not being a chief propaganda officer for the organization,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you
Yeah.
call it for what it is, and
Yeah.
you work your people through that. And ultimately, I think the ultimate responsibility for a leader is if you have people that aren't happy and don't have that cultural alignment, help them find opportunities somewhere else, either somewhere else in the company or somewhere else out in the market, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's,
Yeah.
and that's where you're, releasing the ultimate brand ambassadors, right? Talk about employee experience. Like, hey, listen, company wasn't for me, but man, they loved me up and they helped me get my next opportunity somewhere else. And now I'm killing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is great. I would love your help. Help me make the case for vulnerability for leaders? Because I'm right there with you. I totally agree. But I do think in general, and I think I mentioned this the last time we chatted, we generally have this idea of a leader's the one who has the answers, a leader the one who's kind of the firm rock that keeps everyone else under control. Um, help make the case for vulnerability and what that can do.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that, what you kind of described there is, I think what might be like the stereotypical leader, right? That
Yeah,
we've
yeah,
all, we can all, I mean, and, the phrase gets thrown around a lot. You see it on LinkedIn, but it's about being a servant leader, right? And
hmm,
part of that is being vulnerable because, first of all, you and I both know you don't have all the answers, right? And you don't
yes,
always want to be a smart, the smartest person in the world. And so I think really, without slightly not answering your question directly, all those characteristics you listed are really not the ideal leader that you want. Now, that the reality
yeah,
is that's maybe the leader that you have. So yeah, the argument for, if the argument for being vulnerable is, any leader that you talk to that is frustrated with how their teams are functioning are probably all symptomatic of not being a servant leader, not enabling their folks, and not being
mm,
vulnerable, right? If
yeah,
somebody makes a mistake, if you made a similar mistake or worse
yeah,
mistake, be vulnerable about it. Talk about it, right?
yeah,
It's a learning opportunity because otherwise you're really managing from a place of fear. At
yeah.
the end of the day, if you're not doing that.
Yeah. And it is interesting how very often the same leaders that are complaining that none of their people will like take initiative or solve problems on their own are the ones that are micromanaging and kind of overbearing. And it's like, well, one is kind of causing the other,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, no, that's
So
exactly right. It's a cause and effect. And listen, I'll tell you a quick story. In one of my corporate stops, I ran a mentorship program, and we had a mentor who was phenomenal. Mentees love. I'm going to say them. I won't identify. And in fact, the mentee mentor relationships generally lasted way beyond the formal mentorship, right? Which was a
okay. Yeah.
beautiful thing. But
Yeah.
this individual was a complete tyrant with their direct reports. And I remember
Interesting.
having a conversation with them saying, like, why can't you show up for your team the way you show
Yeah.
up for your mentees? And it was basically like, I can't be that vulnerable. If I give them an inch, they're going to take a yard. And, in fact, and again, there was without judgment on my part because that was their book of beliefs, right? That's how they were
Yeah.
raised as a leader. And so you had everybody that had all the capability of being emotionally intelligent. But in that particular case, they felt like this is the mask I got to wear when I'm leading my team.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure, kind of as you mentioned before, you used the phrase fear-based leadership,
Yeah.
and I have to believe that had a lot to do with it. Of just this idea of like, well, now it's my butt on the line, it's my KPIs, it's my results, and so it's a lot easier for me to be the good leader, be the good emotionally intelligent leader when I don't have any skin in the game. But as soon as I have skin in the game, now I gotta viciously protect myself. Um, I'm sure a lot of it comes back to fear. Interesting. That's
Yeah.
interesting. One, it's interesting timing that we're talking. I mentioned this right before the call, but I just finished listening to the latest season of the podcast Land of Giants, and it was about Disney, where you worked there for a big portion of your career, and so I just I've just spent 6-8 hours kind of immersing myself in the various evolutions of that company as it went, as it invested in television, as it started to invest more in movies and entertainment and into the parks and just all the different variations and changes that it was went through. I have to believe that was from your perspective. I have to believe that there was just it was very clear that these massive changes were happening, and kind of I'd love to kind of hear any reflection you have on, since you were there for so long, through so many changes, probably had so many different leaders during that time, kind of the impact that leaders can have on whether or not a change is effective or not. They might not have anything to do with the change, but just leading how much of an impact good leadership through change can have.
Yeah, no, it's huge. And I have a unique perspective because I was actually with Capital Cities ABC for about a year and a half before Disney purchased us, right? And there
Yeah.
was always
Yeah.
an interesting history between Disney and ABC. It's where Disney aired
Yep.
the Disney Club, so there was always this historical relationship. So it was kind of special when it was purchased, and that was a bit of a cultural clash because you had a lot of leaders who came from an environment where there wasn't a whole lot of competition, right? It was basically the big
Mm.
three networks, and
Yeah.
so
Sure.
it definitely was a big cultural shift. But yeah, those are when you're going through, and particularly that was fairly early on in my career, when you're going through monumental changes like that, and you're young in your career, and you're wow, I'm working for Capital Cities ABC, and now wow, I'm working for Disney. Though all the thoughts of like, what do these changes mean for me to go through it? And yeah, it's those leaders that if I went to them, it's the kind of leader where if you go to them and say, hey, what's happening here, and they say, I don't know, but I'll find out for you, right?
Mm.
um, those are the type of leaders that make a difference in your life, as opposed to they're not telling me anything, I have no idea what's going on, right? And so it's those ones that actually step up in a leadership role, right? And don't,
Yeah.
in many cases, don't even necessarily worry about themselves. Because,
Yeah.
as you think back on it, they have all the thoughts too. Like, hey, I'm a
Yeah.
VP, right? I'm
Yep.
a whatever. What does this mean for me? And when you have those conversations and you don't get any sense of what does this mean for me, and it's all about, understanding what, your fears and trepidations are, those are the best leaders to navigate, navigate through change. And like, look, I've been a change advocate my entire life. And so, one of the things that I had to make a decision on when a significant changes came my way was I going to be a hypocrite, right? You'd be in my
Mm.
class and I'd be telling you how great change was and how you have to embrace it. And it's, one door closes, another a window opens, like, oh, you're right, all that stuff. But then when it came to me, it was gut check time, right? Anytime a big
Yeah.
check to me, like, why does it like suddenly stink now? Change suddenly stink? Or are you going to kind of embrace that? And I, going back to the core of your question, I contribute a lot of the really good leaders that helped me through that to say, listen, you, there are much bigger things happening here than you, right?
Yeah.
When Capital Cities, as much as we appreciate the efforts that you have here, Anthony, when Capital Cities Disney got together, your name wasn't mentioned in in acquisition talks, right?
No,
This is
really, it wasn't in
much
there.
bigger, right? This is much, oh, we're getting Kaleo too. We got to close this deal
Great.
immediately, right? So
Yeah.
it's like this is much bigger than you, and I think that's look. I think leaders who can help you not personalize it so much because it's hard not
Mm.
to, right?
Hmm.
But it vary in any kind of job merger and acquisition, any kind of job change. Very rarely is it ever personal, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I say rarely because do you every once in a while use a riff or a reduction in force, or during a merger, do you look at some people that maybe weren't performing where you needed them to be, right? And but that is really a lot rarer than I think people realize. So
Yeah.
it's leaders having you being able to help you navigate through that change. And quite honestly, I think the biggest thing is really like knowing that I can go to my leader with my fears and not hesitate, right? And
Yeah.
going back to some of those not so great managers I had in the beginning, it I learned very quickly that if I went with them with any kind of fear or any kind of weakness, it was going to be held
Mm.
against me. So that
Mm.
just got me to be quiet and not ask and
Yeah.
just kind of deal with it, right? So the ultimate was I can go in and say anything to my leader, and know that they're going to be there to either say, "Listen, I'm going to help you through this." And I'll get some answers for you, or I'll coach you through what is obviously a difficult time for you.
Yeah. And I have to believe, kind of going back, going full circle back to near the beginning of this conversation, though, you want to be fully present, you want to be there, but we're all people. We all still have inner work that needs to happen. And especially during times of high change, there's going to be, wherever you are in the organization, there is going to be that stress. And so I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, there can still be a case for not being fully authentic. Like there's still a time and a place. Like it's like, oh, I forget what I forget what movie I was listening to or what movie I was watching, but it was a military movie where they're talking about, making complaints and I think it was Saving Private Ryan. It was in Saving Private Ryan where
Yeah,
one of the
yeah,
guys
yeah,
asked him
yeah.
like, "Hey, why don't you ever complain? Why aren't you?" And he's just like, "I have gripes, I have complaints, but they go up. Gripes go up, not down." And I'm sure there's a level of still wanting to wear that mask sometime in some ways, um of just to make it so that when people are coming to you, because what you don't want to be as a leader, I would imagine, is somebody comes to you with their complaints, and now it becomes like, now you're reinforcing and like fueling their complaints. You want to still be a place where people can come and kind of decompress, and it de-escalates the situation. Am
No,
I
for
making any
sure.
sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a beautiful example, and I actually love that scene. And I think that's right. I mean, I think that what you are there is you're there for support and you're there to listen, right? But
Yep.
it's like, hey, I'm stressed out about this, merger too. Yeah, so am I. Get out of my office, right? That's not the answer you want.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want him. You need to be talking to your senior leadership about that. So you need
Yes.
to be poised. You definitely need to show some presence. So when we talk about being vulnerable, it's not a question of like sharing every fear that you have, which you
Yeah.
might do with a partner, right? This is
Yeah.
in a work setting. You do want to be poised. You want to be that. You want to be that. That port in a storm, if you will.
Yeah.
For your people. So no, that I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, and that's we can learn a lot from movies as far as good management principles, and that's definitely one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure through all that change, you saw a lot of it. Well, this has been interesting. This has been a good discussion. I think, so we kind of started with this idea of there's a lot of, what the current state of employee experience is, how that reflects on leaders, what leaders need to be able to do to kind of help their people through all this. Because I think one thing that is definitely true, as chaotic as the past has been, I got to believe there's just as much chaos, for good or bad, in the future. Like, we're just in times that are, times change quickly. There's a lot of change happening right now, and I think a lot of that change is going to fall on leaders to like be able to lead their teams through, to manage through, to kind of create space for their people to feel like they're comfortable. There was a previous podcast where I was talking about where I think we kind of ended with this idea of, your people, like, companies need good managers more today than ever before, because there's just so many stressors. There's so many changes happening, that if you can be a manager who creates a space where people feel comfortable, they feel safe, they feel authentic, it can really make a big difference, which ultimately goes back to where we started, of creating a good employee experience for everybody.
Yeah, no, 100%. And listen, employee experience lives and dies by leadership. Like
Yeah.
you've got to walk the walk and you definitely got to talk the talk. But you're absolutely right. I think the evolution of the leader, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that leaders can do for their employees is prepare them for change, right? Because, with,
Mm,
comfort, part of me, I love the saying comfort's a cage, right? Because it really is. But, that doesn't mean, in a work setting, where you want some financial stability, you want some career stability, you have a certain level of comfort. So it's really preparing your people and being honest about the rate of change. I mean, normally, a lot of fear of change comes from a lack of communication, right?
yes.
It comes at, these little, show up to work one day, with your brown bag, all excited to start your day, and suddenly this big shoe drops, right? And
Yeah.
so, to the extent that, and change management is probably definitely a different conversation for a different day. I will say that more often than not, when people come to you for change management, 99% of the time, it's like, no, you want damage control because you didn't do change management, right? You didn't prepare your people for it.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
best thing that you can do is, and that's that you build that trust with your employees, right?
Yeah.
Because when you
Yeah.
don't have that, that's when they're really freaking out. So I think,
Yeah.
prepare. You're absolutely right. I think that there is this sort of this case of perpetual change, and I saw that. Listen, I've been working for a little while now. I've got a couple of years under my belt, and there used to be a time when a major shoe would drop, And then things were cool for 5 to 10 years, like literally,
Mm,
right? They were,
wow.
and there was some kind of shift. Even when we went through the acquisition with Disney, right? There was some
Yeah.
change, but it really took a long time for Disney to kind of, implant its philosophy
Yeah.
and shape the
Yeah.
organization. Like years, when people thought it would
Yeah.
be happening in weeks. And but it, that came from a culture of like there really wasn't any big changes. People
Yeah.
retired. People stayed in their leadership roles until 20, 30 years into the company.
Yeah.
Now the pace of change is, there are little shoes dropping every day and more shoes dropping every month, right? And so that
Hmm.
that it's been compressed. And so you really gotta prepare your people for change, and the constant change. That way when it comes upon them, you might not be able to prepare them for the specific change that's going to happen, but
Of
just the
course.
idea of not being comfortable and understanding that everything that happens in your life is another opportunity. I mean, I've been through more reduction in forces than my ego wants to admit, but every one of them has led to meeting some extraordinary people who I can tell you, sitting here right now, Matt, I'm better off knowing. And I would have
Yeah.
never known them had I not gone through those changes. And that's just one example of how fortunate I've been through those changes that I've been through.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you're 100% right that as a leader, that's your number one thing, and that's why I really focus on this idea of building trust. I think that is the
Yeah,
foundational skill of any leader, is figuring out how to build trust on your team, because it's a bank that you're going to put money into, and then if you don't know when you're going to have to draw from it,
right.
and when you need to draw it out, it's too late to put any in. You can't, you need it to be there beforehand. This has been a great discussion, Anthony. How should people find you? Are you primarily on LinkedIn? Where should people reach out to you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at CaleoEX.com if
Great.
you want to check out the Caleo site. But yeah, you can find me. You can find me regularly and I'm a regular contributor to LinkedIn. So always love dropping some nuggets and interacting with folks on my posts.
Perfect. Well, this has been a great discussion, Anthony. Thank you so much. We'll definitely link to all of that in the show notes. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You do the same, Matt. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.